In 1950, Ford renamed the custom deluxe wagon the Country Squire as part of Ford's effort to move the wagon from the commercial market to more of a family market. Like its predecessor, it was a two-door, three-row, eight-passenger, partial woody wagon. As such, the body panels of the rear three-quarters were made of mahogany plywood, trimmed in maple or birch. The cars were 208 inches long on a 114-inch wheelbase and weighed in the neighborhood of 3,500 to 3,700 pounds. Power came from a 3.7-liter 226 straight six with 95 horsepower or a 3.9-liter 239 flathead V8 with 100 horsepower, backed by either a 3 or 4-speed manual. Unlike its predecessor, it had several upgrades over the standard Ford sedan, including heavier suspension, wider tires, a larger fuel tank, and easy-to-remove rear seats. Starting at just over $2,000, it was $600 more than a base sedan, with $23,000 being made for the year. Although it only saw minor changes for 1951, sales were up by more than 6,000. The cars were restyled for 1952, with many significant changes, not the least of which was a full steel body. As such, there was now a full line of wagons, with the Country Squire being in line with the top Crestline package, meaning it only came with the V8, now up to 110 horsepower, and a 3-speed Ford-O-Matic automatic was optional. It carried on with the woody look, but the body panels were covered with wood look vinyl, and for a short time, still trimmed in real wood. Although it was now a four-door, the cars were much shorter, at 198 inches long, but on a 115-inch wheelbase, and it had a wider body. At nearly $2,200, it was almost $400 more than the base ranch wagon, and sales were down to under $5,500. There were minor upgrades for 1953 that included optional power steering, followed by power seats and power brakes for 1954. But the big change for that year was a new overhead valve V8, increasing horsepower to 130, and sales were up to nearly 13,000. Although the Woody wagon, fake or otherwise, was coming to an end among other manufacturers, styling was updated for 1955, and the Country Squire trim was now shared with the Fairlane. The engine line was expanded to include the 120 horsepower 3.7-liter 223 mileage maker straight six, as well as the 4.5-liter 272 V8 in 162 and 182 horsepower tunes, as well as the 198 horsepower Thunderbird 4.7-liter 292. The 292 was the base V8 for 1956, and output was up to 202 horsepower, with a bigger optional 225 horsepower 5.1-liter 312, and sales would continue to climb, getting back into the range of the original. Fords were restyled for 1957, longer, lower, and wider, with a new perimeter frame, now 204 inches long on a 116-inch wheelbase, and 3,700 to 3,900 pounds. It was considered a 9-passenger wagon. The 6 was up to 144 horsepower, the 292 212 horsepower, and the 312 245 to 300 horsepower. It was a record year for Ford and the Country Squire, with sales near 28,000. 1958 saw several upgrades, many to the powertrain, including a new family of V8s, offered as a 5.4-liter 332 with 240 to 265 horsepower, or a 5.8-liter 352 with 300 horsepower, and backed by a new optional Cruise-O-Matic. Other new features included available air suspension. It would get bigger for 1959, up to 208 inches long on a 118-inch wheelbase, and 3,800 to 4,100 pounds. With the redesign of 1960, the Country Squire became the wagon counterpart of the new Galaxy. It was slightly bigger at 210 inches long on a 119-inch wheelbase. Suspension was upgraded, and it used the bigger brakes from the F-Series truck, but powertrains carried over. For 1961, rear access changed from a two-piece tailgate and hatch to a tailgate with a roll-down window. Power was down to 135 in the 6, the 292 to 175 horsepower, and the 352 to 220 to 300 horsepower, the top version of which was replaced in 1962 by a 6.4-liter 390 with the same 300 horsepower, but torque was up 46. The 292 was replaced in 1963 by an 164 horsepower 4.3-liter 260 V8, which grew to an 195 horsepower 289 the following year. Sales had continued to climb through the period, and by this point were nearly 50,000, partly because the wood look was returning to popularity. There was an all-new Country Squire for 1965, becoming the counterpart of the Galaxy 500. The frame was boxed, the front track was widened, and rear leaf springs were replaced by coils. The base engine became a 3.9-liter 240 Big 6 with 150 horsepower, while the V8s carried over with a 200 horsepower 289, 250 horsepower 352, and 300 horsepower 390, and the third row was changed to two side-facing seats accessed through the rear. There would be two versions of the 390 for 1966, with 275 or 315 horsepower, and the high-performance 345 horsepower 428 became available for the first time. The 352 was dropped for 1967 in favor of a 270 horsepower version of the 390. For 1968, front styling was revised, and it became the LTD Country Squire, with sales reaching over 90,000, and the 289 was replaced by a 210 horsepower 302, while the 390 and 428 were at 265 and 340 horsepower respectively. With the restyle of 1969, wheelbase increased to 121 inches and length to 219, and the 6 was no longer offered in the Country Squire. Now having the 302 as the base engine, the top engine became a 7-liter 429 with 320 to 360 horsepower, and the tailgate was replaced by a 3-way magic door gate that worked as a tailgate and a side hinge door. Mid-year, the 302 was replaced by a 5.8-liter 351 with 250 horsepower. There was an extensive facelift for 1971 that removed the hidden headlights, and the 390 was replaced by a 6.6-liter 402 marketed as a 400, providing similar horsepower, but torque was up by 25. As with the rest of the U.S. industry, 1972 saw the move to net horsepower ratings, putting the 351 at 153 horsepower, the 400 at 172 horsepower, and the 429 at 208 horsepower, and a bigger 7.5-liter 460 was added with 224 horsepower. There would be another facelift for 1973, in line with the required 5-mile-an-hour bumper, stretching the car to 223 inches. The 400 became the base engine, and it would be the peak sales year for the Country Squire at approximately 143,000. A similar 5-mile-an-hour rear bumper was added for 1974, increasing length another couple of inches, and the 429 would be dropped. For 1975, the hidden headlights returned to put it in line with the LTD Landau and to distinguish the Country Squire from lesser LTD wagons. But changes would be minor for the next couple of years, with an 145 horsepower 351 returning for 1978. But then they would be downsized for 1979 at 216 inches long on a 114-inch wheelbase, and weight was reduced 700 pounds to just over 2 tons. Engine choices became the 5-liter 302 and 5.8-liter 351, rated at 130 or 145 horsepower. But 1982 was the last year of the non-Woody LTD wagon, and the 351 would be dropped, leaving the 302 as the only engine. Restructuring of Ford's lineup had the LTD becoming the Crown Victoria LTD, and there was a new smaller Victoria LTD, or just LTD. But the Country Squire remained the LTD Country Squire, with little change, although horsepower was up to 145 for the 302. 1986 added a better-equipped LX version, and the V8 moved to fuel injection, increasing horsepower to 150. The car would be refreshed inside and out for 1988 with new seats and improved aerodynamics. And for 1990, the instrument panel would be updated. But the wagon market had disappeared, and sales dropped below 10,000, so it was discontinued after a limited run of less than 4,091 models were made, putting an end to the traditional Ford station wagon. Ford had introduced the first factory station wagon as a version of the Model A way back in 1929, and naturally, it was a Woody wagon. and when the Woody was discontinued by other makes in the late 50s and early 60s, the Country Squire carried on, which not only makes the Ford the longest-running station wagon, but the longest-running Woody wagon. And although the Country Squire was exclusive to the top line of full-size cars from Ford, a Squire Woody package was offered across the Ford line on several models at various points, the first being the Falcon Squire introduced in 1962. Ford offered a Fairlane Squire for 1963, then dropped it only to bring it back in 1966. In 1968, it transitioned to the higher trim level Torino Squire, and carried through as the Gran Torino Squire, then the LTD2 Squire, and eventually the Granada Squire. Not the only fox-bodied Squire, as there was a Fairmont Squire starting in 1978. And when the Pinto wagon was introduced in 1972, there was a Pinto Squire version that would carry over to the Escort Squire of the 1980s. The Country Squire was not the last vehicle to be offered with a simulated wood look, but it was a trend that is unlikely to return again. So as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.